I imagine that we're all here because we share a common interest, a concern, or purpose. We want to see that people we know, we love, who suffer from mental illnesses, including the addictions, benefit from the help that can make a difference in their lives and the lives of their families. That's why I wrote my book, which you mentioned, and I put up here the cover, The Family Guide to Mental Health Care. And I'm going to talk about this book, and I'm going to talk about it in part by illustrating the experience of families through a tale of two families. By way of introduction, mental illness is ubiquitous. 1 in 5 people in this country, likely every country, annually suffer from a serious mental illness. If 1 in 5 people are ill with a serious illness, an illness that affects their functioning, that means that virtually no family or friend or people we know at work will be unfamiliar with mental illness or potentially spared its impact. And my work as a state mental health director has made me acutely aware of what families experience, what they face, and what many of them learn to do and what they need to learn to do in order to help their loved one get care that he or she will need, and then also to advocate strongly, because in mental health care and in care for any medical condition, you have to learn the system and you have to learn how to to advocate for the care that you want. So my story here, with all due apologies to A Tale of Two Cities, is one of two families. And I believe we can see the dilemmas that families consider from this story. One family, one group of families, I call the blue families. And they're sadly typical in their experience of mental health care for a loved one. The other I call the green families, where possibilities for their loved one and themselves are more heartening. Both the blue and the green families have a loved one with a mental illness. Perhaps it's a teenage son who's been skipping out of school, staying locked up in his room with heavy metal music blaring and an aromatic odor drifting from below the door. Perhaps in a family it's a spouse or a sister who's become unemployed. She's taken to bed, not changing her clothes for days, is sullen and easily angered, and says she has no prospects for the future. Perhaps in a family it's a parent or grandparent who, after a physical illness or loss, has given up, doesn't answer the phone and won't go to family events, picks it as food, and talks about being a burden, that life isn't worth living. Both the blue and green families face two great challenges, and this is why I wrote this book, because after learning about the illness itself, what families encounter are two principal problems. I've learned this from families, and I've heard this again and again from the questions I'm asked and colleagues are asked. The two great challenges. The first is navigating a mental health system that can confuse and even exasperate them, despite the committed efforts of the people who work in it. And the second challenge is helping a loved one who won't go or remain in treatment, who feels hopeless, or whose shame or guilt or denial keeps him or her from getting services that could make a difference. We all know these families, and some of you, no doubt, are living these stories. It was because of these challenges, and if you go to Amazon, there are about 70,000 mental health titles, and they organize principally in terms of diagnosis, depression or eating disorder or schizophrenia, bipolar, or treatments. But what I discovered was there was no book that, no resource that specifically spoke to families' experience of navigating the mental health system and helping their loved one get care. So that was what had me put together this book, and to try to help families help their loved ones. So let's turn to blue families. The blue family sees that something serious is happening, but they don't quite know what the matter is, or who, or where to turn. They may call a mental health clinic and be put on hold, and again, then given an appointment weeks away that they seriously doubt their loved one will attend. They may be frozen or unable to act, or worse, in their distress, they may start fighting amongst themselves. Four out of 5 people with mental illness, with serious mental illness in this country, and their families, don't get what they need to recover. That's 80% of people with serious mental illness are not identified, properly diagnosed, or effectively treated. That's called the quality gap. And what makes it so tragic is that we know that our treatments can be effective. In fact, they're just as effective for treatments as treatments for persistent physical disorders, whether it's asthma, diabetes, hypertension, heart disease. The trajectory of untreated illness is what is the greatest tragedy to behold. So untreated mental illness in youth results in their falling behind in school and at work. It portends later disability for youth. Untreated mental illness, this concept of the duration of untreated illness, is a high predictor of later disability, likely the result of the progression of the disease, the untreated disease in the brain. Remember, too, that suicide is the 3rd leading cause of death in older teenagers and young adults. It's actually the 2nd leading cause of death in youth 12 to 17. Untreated illness in adults and working people impairs their job performance and puts in peril the financial stability of a family. For many adults, especially seniors, untreated mental illness increases their risk for medical disability and death from the physical illnesses that are a part of aging, like heart disease, diabetes, Parkinson's, and other neurological disorders. This is what that quality gap means for youth, for adults, for seniors, for families. And we as professionals all know these blue families, and it wouldn't be at all a surprise to me that some people listening indeed might be blue families themselves. And we all know for these families the stress of not being able to do what they want to do more than anything else, namely help their loved one take care of himself, is what is heartbreaking. The green family is more fortunate. They live with possibility because they've learned how to respond. They've learned where to turn, who to trust, how to work with and advocate for their loved one. They understand what good care looks like and what to do when it's not happening. Some families won't need our help. They're the fortunate ones. So someone told me that the president has a relative who has alcoholism as well, so I'm not sure even the Obama family is spared. But for those families who need help, and there are many, they need a route out of this blue existence. They need our help of managing the unwelcome visitor of mental illness. So I want to do 2 things on this foundation. First, I want to offer suggestions to families about what they can do to not be in that 80% who don't get the care that can make a difference. And second, for those of you who are mental health professionals, I want to also talk about what we can do, even if given one chance, to meet and reach a family in distress. If any of us, as a social worker, psychologist, nurse, counselor, psychiatrist, has that chance, how can we make the most of it? And I believe that there may be many of you on the line like that. I also know that many mental health professionals are themselves family members, and despite their training, may not be prepared when mental illness strikes their home. So what can families do that can make a difference? And this is really the heart of my talk today, which is really what can you do, what you're not to do, and what are the alternatives. So these are the four messages, and I'm going to get into detail on each of them. The first is, don't go it alone. Second is, don't get into fights. There are alternatives that work better. Third, learn the rules of how mental health care works and learn how to bend those rules. And fourth, appreciate that you're on more of a marathon than a sprint. And what I do in the book and Family Guide is essentially to offer people information about all of these, but these are the messages that I think emerge, or though they're not on any one page in the book. So let me go into each of these first. Don't go it alone. I recall one Blue family who grew more ashamed as their son became more odd, wearing layers of clothing and muttering to himself. They didn't know where to turn. These parents avoided their friends and stopped going to church. They hardly spoke with each other because when they did, they argued and felt more hopeless. All families need to know that mental health problems, including addictions, are among the most common medical problems that exist. That means that there are others in that family, in the extended family, among friends and coworkers who have been down the same road. So I like to ask a family or friend of someone with a mental illness whose life is just unraveling, if they're not doing well, I'd like to ask that person, who can you confide in? Do they know someone who's had a depression, an addiction, a traumatic disorder, or another mental problem and has been open about it? And thankfully, many more people are. That's someone they can turn to. We can remind the family, or families here listening, that they can turn to a primary care doctor or clergy, someone who's known their loved one for some time. We as mental health professionals, those of us who are in that role, can even offer to call the doctor or clergy person. Mental health professionals can help doctors or clergy help families. Families may also be able to turn, if it's a youth, to a school counselor, or at work to employee assistance programs. I urge families to turn to advocacy organizations like your own here, International Bipolar, or the National Alliance on Mental Illness, or Mental Health America. I almost always do. These are amazing organizations that are often staffed by experienced and trained people. Some of them are by family members themselves. And these are organizations that have gathered information, know their local communities, know where to turn, and know how to coach people so they don't have to go it alone. So all of these, whether it's friends, family, advocacy organizations, professionals, there are many places to turn. People don't need to go it alone. This lesson has been learned with every persistent illness, not just mental illness, but persistent illnesses like colitis, diabetes, cancer, Alzheimer's, and countless other conditions. Mental illnesses are no different. Second, don't get into fights. This may be the hardest prescription of all. A family or friend faced with mounting evidence of serious problems in their loved one, and their efforts to reason are defied, ignored, not listened to, and their worry and their love driving their worry, a family often will want to push harder, insist that their loved one faces facts, does something. Tempers escalate, voices boom, or even go silent. And what happens is that each side digs in more deeply. That's a moment when family members, friends need to take a deep breath, take some distance, not strike while the iron is hot. And the alternatives that I've learned and that I've learned from families is that what can work, it's not that it works all the time or that it's easy, but that can work is a combination of listening and leverage. Listening is how to figure out what's going on. Then leverage can come into play. I believe that all behavior serves a purpose. All behavior serves a purpose. We just may not know yet what it is. Listening is how to find out, not by crossing swords. For example, one family learned that mom stayed home from work because she couldn't concentrate and thought she would be seen as incompetent and feel mortified. For example, one family learned that their daughter panicked, literally couldn't breathe, when trying to eat, which she managed by food restriction, losing weight to a dangerous degree. We call that anorexia nervosa. Listening can help, even if it takes time. And by the way, trying to understand, listening and trying to understand doesn't mean that the behavior is fine or that you're agreeing or condoning it. But listening avoids a fight, and it's a means of understanding what's driving the behavior and causing the suffering. It's not enough, though, because that's where a family's leverage comes in. Being a part of a family is a two-way street. You get and you give. So when I'm with a family, I ask, and I urge others to ask, what supports is your family providing? Like a cell phone, money, car, even a place to stay. These are leverage points that can be used to negotiate for what needs to be done. A family can and does give, but not unconditionally. What does a loved one need to do, ultimately, in their own interest? To continue to receive money, use the car, or stay together. I recall one family, that of an Afghanistan war returnee, where the wife finally said to her husband he needed to get help or get out. This was a man who was waking up repeatedly during the night, thrashing, becoming highly irritable, drinking way too much, with a really short fuse. She was scared. It's really hard to set that limit, really hard, but often the alternative can be worse. I recall another family, and this was one I worked with, whose daughter had been on was a student, college student, who on with credit cards and an ample allowance, which she was using to buy drugs. And they shut off her credit cards and allowance because after a while they realized that she wasn't going to school. She was essentially now dependent on drugs. And it took them a long time to do that because they were really worried that if they shut off her funds, that she would prostitute herself. And that was a real concern. So this is often a choice between being in between a rock and a hard place. But untreated addiction, untreated mental illness, that isn't apt to get better. So families sometimes have to set these limits, and it's sometimes the most difficult decisions they have to make. So that's leverage. Avoiding a fight is not the same thing as being disengaged. In fact, it's staying just as involved, but in a different way. Families need to listen, use their leverage, not get into a fight. Once you're in a fight, the battle is usually lost. Third, Learn the rules of how the mental health care system works and learn how to bend those rules. Families are apt to discover just how Byzantine, just how odd the mental health system can be, how often they can't get what they need, it's too confusing, they're sent one place or another, and it's not just confusing, but also they're not given the kind of information that they need. Think of those families with kids at college who don't hear from the school when their child stops going to classes or has a serious medical event or disciplinary action. Think of those families who see a loved one deteriorating or discover their loved one has a weapon, who call a hospital or mental health clinic and then are told, sorry, we can't speak with you without permission. We don't have consent from your loved one. Think of those families whose loved one is receiving a number of professional services. They're going to a clinic, seeing a psychiatrist, in a return to work program, have a care manager. And these clinicians don't speak to each other. Like it or not, families will need to become vocal advocates for what their loved one needs. Not because dedicated clinicians don't try. It's because of outdated laws and a fragmented mental health care system. So families will and can learn what good care looks like and what to do when it's not happening. They'll need help from others who've been there, including professionals, to do this. But it can be, not that you have to learn all the 20 different types of antidepressants or antipsychotics, but what are certain principles of comprehensive care, continuous care, evidence-based care, that these are principles that guide good care and that are fair to ask about and to insist upon. Families can learn from others how to escalate their need for information or intervention up the administrative chain until they find a responsive person. It's not fun, but it works. Families can learn that there's no prohibition against clinicians listening. Many advocacy organizations help families learn that even when a loved one does not provide consent, families can say, you to clinicians, you may not be able to speak to me, but you can listen to me. That's bending the rules. And you need to listen because my son, my daughter, my spouse is not going to tell you that he's using drugs and drinking heavily, that he's storing a weapon in his room. He's not going to tell you that because he's sick. But I know it, and you need to know it because you won't know what is going on or how best to treat this person. So you need to listen, and there's no prohibition against that. Families need a lot of support to assert themselves this way because, it's hard enough talking to doctors whom we bestow with all kinds of authority, but if you're poor or people of color, not fully, don't have the same education as others, it's very hard to assert yourself. So we need to give permission. We need to coach families to advocate aggressively and to bend the rules. It may not be fair. It's certainly not right. It's not fun. But mental health care in general, healthcare in general, not just mental health care, now demands informed and assertive families and consumers. Fourth message, last and no less important, is that families need to realize that they're on more of a marathon than a sprint. The cartoon here says, sometimes I lie awake at night and I ask myself, where have I gone wrong? Then a voice says to me, this is going to take more than one night. Managing most illnesses means taking a long view, sticking with it. There are periods of improvement and moments when ground is lost. Relapse or recurrence of illness can be terribly demoralizing for the person who's ill and their family. A family's morale and determination will be tested. Families need to understand And as has been said, they need to believe that they should never, ever give up. Never give up. It's often difficult to predict, and clinicians know this. If you're around long enough, you learn this, that sometimes difficult to predict a person's involvement in care or their illness improves. We just are not good at knowing when. Mental health clinicians have learned this lesson, and we owe that information to families. We owe the information that things can change. People with serious mental illness and addictions, actually who have done well, who've built full and satisfying lives, may not be very visible. They may not broadcast their illness, so they're not around to stand as examples. They may be uncertain about their gains, fearful of stigma, or they may just simply want to put the past behind them. Families need to hear and learn about people who have mental illness and addictions and who have built successful lives. I have very accomplished colleagues who've been open about their illness. I like to tell their stories. I have stories of people I've treated and colleagues have treated with serious depression, bipolar disorder, anorexia, early trauma, and schizophrenia, all these conditions. People who have learned to live with their illness and make lives with love and work. Families need to hear these stories. They need to know, because this is a source of hope. This is a way of our giving hope to people who are not knowing that there may be a time when things will get better. One more thing on this long road I do with the family, and I encourage other professionals and caregivers to do. Caregiver burden easily leads to caregiver burnout. So it's not selfish to pace yourself or to set limits. If a family exhausts its emotional and financial capital caring for a loved one all up front or early on, they won't have those resources, emotional and financial, to be there for the long run. So the last message, the fourth message, is be prepared for a long road, because mental illnesses, like so many other illnesses, are not overnight matters. Much has changed in recent decades in the way mental health professionals think and practice with families. I believe that indeed much has changed. We as professionals have learned to say to families, it's not your fault. It's not your fault. We've come to appreciate that for a person with a mental illness, their family can be and often is their greatest asset. And we've come to recognize that recovery is not a slogan. It's now become, importantly, a core premise in mental health care. Lives of meaning, purpose, dignity, relationships, and contribution are what we all want and are possible with people with mental illness. So recovery is about hope. Fundamentally, recovery is about hope. And hope, good treatment, hard work, and tincture of time are the best medicine for whatever condition a person may have. So in finishing up, my book, my message for families is fourfold. First, don't go it alone. Second, don't get into fights. Third, be vocal, insistent advocates who learn the rules and how to bend them. And fourth, never, ever give up. Never give up. And that's how blue families can become more like green families, which is about there being in the 20% or expanding that 20% of people who actually do better because they get into care, they stay in care, and they have the right kind of care. So that brings me to the end of my comments. Not this cartoon. And now I'm very keen on your comments and questions. Thank you.
Thank you. That was wonderful. Each of you should have a control panel box where you can type in any questions you may have. Our first question is, does an acute psychotic episode where an individual has experienced intense auditory, visual, and tactile hallucinations meet the classic definition of a traumatic event?
So let me see if I understand the question. Whether the symptoms of an acute psychosis are a traumatic event? Is there a way for me to look? Are the questions typed in that I can see them?
Unfortunately, they're not.
But do I have the question correct?
Correct.
Okay. Well, it may be helpful to think about the difference between stress and trauma. So having the experience of fear that derives from a delusion that someone is trying to help you, to hurt you, and that other people don't appreciate this, or hearing voices that are insulting to you, deeply damaging in terms of statements about you. These are profound stressors, and they're why people with these untreated illnesses have that look of terror often that they have. Trauma is you often defined more in a different way, which has to do with witnessing a event that is life-threatening or actually having a life-threatening event. And so the whole world of disaster, of natural and human-made disasters, whether they're bombings or whether they're hurricanes or floods, these are traumatic events, as are early trauma where youth are abused or exploited, or people who are tortured or need to run from their own countries, or have witnessed other people have catastrophic events. These are that's more the way trauma is defined. So I think to get back to your question, that that hallucinations and delusions are deeply stressful, but that we think about them differently from trauma.
Thank you. Our next question is, what kind of care can a family with a non-compliant loved one ask for?
Well, if that person who's not wanting to get care, and I try to stay away from the term not compliant, because it gets back to my point about behavior serving a purpose. So they're not doing what you or I might want them to do, what might seem sensible, for a reason. They may be locking themselves up in their room because they do believe that if they step out the room, someone is going to injure them or kidnap them or something terrible. So they're not taking medications because they think they're not sick. Why in the world would they take medicines or medicines with these side effects if they're not sick? So it gets back to this point of both being able to observe and jot down what you're observing in terms of behavior, getting other people in the family and others to validate what you're seeing, because you yourself may not trust what you're seeing or feel confident, and then having another voice or voices in terms of speaking with someone who's ill to say, you spent the whole weekend in bed, or you haven't changed your clothes in several days, or every time there's a little sound on the street, you You act as if you jump, and you hide in the doorway, as if there was a sniper on the roof. So you need that kind of observed behavior, because it's not judgmental. It's observing that something is going on and that others are observing. And then you also then need to understand, what does somebody want? Because that's often where the negotiation begins. There's your leverage, but there's also, what does somebody want? Do they want to be able to sleep better? Do they want to be able to go to school? Do they want a job or a date? All these then, the observations, the sense that somebody has something they want, because that's where their engagement begins. So you want that, well, you're not going to be able to get a date by locking yourself up in the room, or a job for that matter. So let's talk about what may be necessary so you're able to get what you want, and then there's the leverage. So this is a complex set of activities, but all told, these are the ways that families can learn to help somebody who doesn't want to go for care get the care that can make a difference.
Thank you. The next question is, will a mental illness, for example schizophrenia, become worse over time if left untreated, or if the loved one is continually on and off medication? Is it harder to obtain a response from medication than more?
Yeah, this is a terrific question. So where this question is particularly worrisome is in youth, and I think I'd alluded to that, but let me make another point about that. So youth, and I'm talking about teenagers here, who develop a psychotic illness like schizophrenia or bipolar illness, schizoaffective disorder, particularly schizophrenia and schizoaffective disorder, that an untreated psychotic illness is highly associated with later disability, which means that youth in his or her 20s is unable to function, is unable to get a job or complete school or live independently. That person becomes disabled. There's a very high correlation with untreated serious mental illness in youth and later disability. So that's a grave consequence from untreated illness, and it's likely the progression of the illness in the brain. So this is a principle called early intervention, which is that you want to be able to help somebody get treatment early, whether that's diabetes or depression or bipolar disorder, or heart disease or hypertension. Because what you're doing there is you're limiting the progression of the disease, because untreated disease progresses. In the case of mental disorders, not only is the disease apt to progress, or there are more relapses, recurrences. The more time somebody becomes acutely ill, the more likely they're to become acutely ill in the future. This is a type of observation that says if you've been sick several times, you're apt to get sick again. Thought to be related to processes in the brain called kindling, where it doesn't take much to start a fire again. And and then the other fact is untreated illness also means that people don't progress in their life. So, we're always learning things as youth, as adults. If you're ill, you're not developing skills, you're not learning, and so you tend to fall behind. So for many reasons, untreated illness is indeed a tragedy because of the trajectory of untreated mental illness.
Bipolar is mostly talked about as a mood disorder, but could it also cause cognitive disability, like forgetting, not being able to follow instructions?
Yes. So many of mental illness, in fact, impairs our ability to concentrate, to focus, our working memory, various what are called executive functions in the brain, the kind of things that we rely on to attend this webinar, or to go into a supermarket and buy the things that we need, or perform the work of a parent or a professional. So so if your mind is absorbed, your mind is racing too much because you're in a manic state or too depressed where you can't concentrate, or you feel hopeless, or it's very hard to take any interest or pleasure, these all impair our mental functioning, our cognitive functioning, and they do a lot of damage to everyday life.
Someone said that you're speaking to their largest frustration with the system. It does not lend itself to engagement in treatment. You're describing my son. How do we appeal to legislators?
That's a great question, and well, I'm glad my message. You want to do that through organized advocacy organizations like this International Bipolar Organization, others, NAMI, because as individuals it's very hard, but as collective organizations, as voters, that's where elected officials can be influenced. Even my job as a state official, I rely on the advocacy done by other organizations, because then if elected officials say, well, we need to do something about how the access to mental health services in this county or this region, or we need to be better insistent that care is done to a certain quality standard, then that makes my day, because then I'm in a position to do my job, which is about access and quality. But if I go knock on the legislator's door, I'm just another government official. So it is through advocacy organizations, voting blocs, people who say that we can do better. Even the meeting that President Obama held a week ago Monday at the White House, unfortunately driven by some of the profound mental health, tragic, violent events that have occurred. But this was a meeting about mental health care, not about guns and violence, but it was about mental health care. That meeting is happening. That meeting happened, and meetings will happen, and things will start to be a little different, I hope, as a result of that, because of persistent advocacy, because of organizations that are saying, you need to do more, here's what you need to do, and then people like me can actually do their job better.
Thank you. We just have a couple more personal stories, but one is, my wife is bipolar and I don't trust a psychiatrist because all the different medications have not worked. And my wife is either often seriously over-medicated, sleeping all the time, or crying, depressed, suicidal. Years of different drug cocktails have failed to improve her condition, and in fact, it appears to be getting worse. What are the next steps to try or ask for in terms of treatment?
That's a terrific question. It starts with this person speaking with his wife about whether she sees the same problems with the treatment, that either it's not working, the side effects are too great, because in the end it is her life, and it is her illness, and it is her body. So so it starts with then going to the person who is being under treatment. And then if that person agrees, then it's about going to the doctor or nurse, whoever is prescribing, and be prepared. And I talk about this in my book, because in that short period of time, people often become pretty tongue-tied, or they're reluctant to say, so be prepared. And I talk about how to prepare for meetings with the doctor, what questions you want to write down, and even at the beginning of a meeting to say, I know our time is short, and I know there are things you're going to want to ask me and need to tell me, but I want to make sure that before we leave here, we're going to have a chance to talk about why we're here today, which is that we're concerned that the treatment, it doesn't seem to be doing as much as we'd hoped. Here's what we had hoped for. It's not happening. Or that you may not be aware, but the side effects are really quite compromising. So it's about also going into a meeting with the doctor or nurse, whoever's prescribing, clinician, knowing and believing that you're there as a fair partner, that this is about your life and your care, and you need to assert yourself, but you need to prepare to do that. So it's about working with the loved one, about coming to a common agreement, going to an appointment, being ready for the appointment, and making sure that you're going to capture some of that appointment time because it is your appointment.
Thank you for answering that. The next one is, I have a 40-year-old nephew who lives with my husband and I. Though he is currently working, he suffers from high anxiety being around people. The result is he comes home from work and goes to his bedroom, plays video games, watches TV. It is sad to see his life pass without having the joy of his own family. He does take his medication, but sometimes not consistently. Is there anything besides being kind and supportive and occasionally encouraging him when he is open to it that we can do?
Yeah, that's also another sad story, but it makes a lot of sense. If someone is highly anxious around other people, they may be able to bear that part of the day, but then as soon as they don't have to meet a certain responsibility, they're going to want to avoid a situation that makes them feel so uncomfortable. So avoidance is what we all tend to do when we're faced with something that really makes us feel terrible. But there's another side to it, which is about saying, well, to this person, well, what's the price of that avoidance? I'm sure you're aware of that. And what else might be done that would help you be more able to have a more robust, a richer life, which is what we all want, which is lives with other people in them, lives of contribution, lives that are not just gritting and bearing a day, but being able to enjoy a day. So, the medications are often an essential part of treatment, but infrequently are they sufficient. So people need to think about, well, what else could make a difference, like some type of psychotherapy, particularly cognitive therapies, which have very strong evidence for being effective with anxiety conditions. Other people discovered that there are alternative medicine approaches like yoga or exercise, even ways by which people use nutrition effectively to help with their moods. There are many ways to enhance our ability to cope with a condition, and they tend to be additive. So if you combine medication with therapy, and in addition people learn some mind-body techniques like yoga or breathing exercises that help calm anxiety, that these are ways by which people can do a lot better and have more of the life that they want.
Thank you. And we have time for one more question. Can you comment on HIPAA? Is the problem with the law or the interpretation of the law, or is the problem not about HIPAA?
Okay, that's a terrific question. So HIPAA is a federal privacy law established some time ago. And for those of you who may be interested, I had an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal on January 12th of this year, where I spoke to the issue of what I believe to be problematic laws in privacy laws, in particular HIPAA. There's another privacy law, which is one that governs what's going on in schools. It's called FERPA, all these acronyms. But basically, they limit school officials and school personnel or health professionals from providing information without written consent. And for families, the experience here is just that they are being closed out of a role where they could actually make a difference. And some colleges even, like Cornell University, have said, to hell with FERPA. We're not going to pay attention to some federal law that in the end could mean that a family won't get information or won't be able to be helpful to their child in college. We're just not going to take that risk. And on the HIPAA side, as I was illustrating in the talk, that there are ways to say to health professionals, you know, you may not be able to talk to me, but you can listen to me. There's no law against that. And some health professionals, recognizing sometimes how dire or serious a problem can be, they'll say, look, I'd rather be sued for a HIPAA violation than not talk to somebody who could help or give me information that could prevent some catastrophic event, whether it's a suicide or a violent event. So these are laws that had very good intentions, which was to protect privacy, but in some ways they have swung in some instances too far in the other direction. And there are people who are very aware of this. There are even hearings in Washington going on now wondering about whether there ought to be some more exceptions to the HIPAA privacy rule.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sederer. That was really great and educational. So we really appreciate all the time you spent with us this morning. And thank you, everyone, for attending our webinar. Before we leave, I just wanted to let everyone know that all our webinars and lectures are free. So if you can, we ask that you make a donation at internationalbipolarfoundation.org/donate if you can, and we really appreciate it. And thank you again, Dr. Sederer.